This class will be taught by Selena Legrano from the Garden Hotline. She will be our wonderful host today. She'll be teaching you a plethora of things, but a few key points is she'll show you how to choose safe materials for building raised beds in your garden, how to determine how healthy the soil is in your garden, and test for toxins, as well as how to gauge which sites will be the most suitable for edible plants. I'm interested in that one. And now I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Selena.
Awesome, thank you. Let me just get my set up. All right, so everyone can see this, I hope. And I'm actually going to turn my screen off while I present, just for the possibility that internet gets wonky, which every once in a while it does. So just in case, and then I'll turn myself back on afterwards so we can be face to face again. Okay, so I've been, just real quick, I've been with the hotline for 5 years now, and we are funded by Seattle Public Utilities and Hazardous Waste, which allows us to be able to offer these classes to the public. So thank you, City of Federal Way, for letting me be a part of this today. And we are going to talk about healthy edible gardening. And just to begin, I have a couple of poll questions in the beginning. If you guys wouldn't mind just typing in the chat box for me, just the numbers is fine. You don't have to spell out everything. But just, why do you want to grow food? Maybe it's something because you want to grow healthy food for your family. You want to grow vegetables to donate to a food bank, something to do outside, or just sharing gardening with your children or your family members. I'll just give a second for that. Awesome, thank you. And then one more poll question before we get started. How much do you know about garden planning? One, nothing at all, very little, or a great deal. Awesome, thank you, thank you. Okay, now for the fun part where we actually get to talk about gardening and looking at our lovely yards. So we're going to kind of look at how to evaluate your site, looking at the appropriate locations, talking more about soil, because that's very important, thinking about watering, thinking about pests, making sure we have a plan for that. And then sometimes containers is a better option for our gardens and our yards, and then also looking at some plant options at the end for being able to choose different types depending on what you want to grow and what space considerations you might have. So one of the first things that we often think about is when we're thinking about edible plants, we often think about our veggies and our fruits. And most of our types of annuals, biennials, and perennials that we need, a lot of times need to have quite a bit of sun. So they need usually around 6 to 8 hours of direct sun. And so this is even including like in the winter times. I know oftentimes we have very little sun in the winter time, but there is still light and we are still getting light through those clouds. So just thinking about that too, about where you have your plants placed. We do have stuff that can tolerate the partial shade. And a lot of times we're looking at things like our greens. So lettuces, spinach, arugula, things like mint, chives, parsley, and then our cole crops. These are like our brassicas. So collards, broccoli, cauliflower. These guys can all take more shade. Some of the things that need more of that sun are what we call our hot crops. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, those really need basil. Those need those more direct hot sun types of areas of the day. It's interesting, and oftentimes we forget, but there are different structures that might be blocking areas that can actually contribute to shady spots within our yards. So thinking about different buildings, fences, and then also tall conifers or evergreen trees that may be creating some sort of shade at different parts of the day. So when we're looking at how we're planning our garden, where we're putting it in the yard, thinking about these different types of structures or plants, because they are going to impact how we will decide where we're going to put a lot of our different garden spaces. Deciduous trees are something a little bit different. They create shade in the summertime, but then they open up because of losing their leaves in the wintertime. So it's important to think about that. Sometimes it's a great spot to be able to put something that maybe needs protection from the hot afternoon sun, but needs to have more of that bright light in the wintertime when we have less light available. It will give it a little bit more light when we have less hours of the day. Slope of the garden. So this is something that we try and think about. A little bit of a slope is not generally something we need to worry about too much, but if you have a pretty steep slope, thinking about how the water actually runs down can really impact and create microclimates in your yard. So in this picture, we have blueberries, and it's a little hard to see in it, but at the top, it's a significant slope. And so at the top, the blueberries are actually much shorter than at the bottom, because all of the water is running to the bottom and creating a more moist environment, which blueberries like. And so the one on the bottom is actually getting more water and is growing better than the ones up at the top. So this can also impact if you want to maybe have a plant that likes to have a drier environment, putting it up towards the top of a hill, it will have more drainage than something at the bottom. So thinking about that when we're thinking about the different types of plants that we want to put in and what their type of growing environment is. Thinking about the direction of your house or your yard and where you're putting stuff, our north sides are often much cooler and shadier because of how the sun comes through. Our south sides are our hottest side because it's getting that sun most of the day. We have our east side where we get our morning sun. So this is a good spot for stuff that needs some light, but they don't like that hot afternoon light. Whereas our west facing is generally very hot afternoon as the sun is coming down. So thinking about that when you're deciding which plants to put in and where you can kind of poke them around within the yard to be able to determine the best space possible. And then also, I just remembered we didn't mention in the beginning, if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we will go through them at the end. And then we can also unmute at the end to ask questions live too. Just want to make sure people are getting questions answered. So temperature in the garden. So in the Northwest, we are considered a zone 8B-ish, right around there. So thinking about that, we usually have a pretty temperate type of environment. So we can have, most things can grow, but we still get those cooler types of afternoons and evenings, and then also in the winter time. So thinking about that, we have different areas and pockets in the garden that can change depending on where they are. So not only within our own specific garden spaces, but also where we are within the Pacific Northwest. So areas where you're up on a hill, oftentimes you're going to have more wind exposure. It can be a little bit drier and cooler. Sometimes in those lower lying areas, you're going to have cool pockets because the way that the cooler temperatures sink, you're going to have this kind of area where the cool weather just kind of sits. So you're going to have earlier and later frosts. So thinking about that when and how to protect different types of crops, when you're going to be putting them out in the gardens, or maybe to what degree of hardiness some of the plants are that you want to put outside. A lot of times we have different ways that we can use microclimates or areas within our garden spaces or our houses and yards to our benefit. So looking at different reflected surfaces to create kind of a heat sinks or different types of materials that can actually create warmer environments. So planting along a driveway or a sidewalk, that cement or the brick is going to actually hold heat longer in the day, making it a warmer space. So you can actually get a little bit more growing season in those specific little microclimates. Having a lighter or a shiny spot will help reflect that sun, creating, once again, a warmer environment. Planting stuff up next to a house helps to protect stuff and under the eaves. So you're creating these little warm pockets, which sometimes can allow you to kind of stretch the limits of what some plants can actually have in or grow in the garden spaces. So it's a fun way to be able to kind of play around with some of those special types of plants that maybe need a little bit more protection. When we like to think about, so we talked about kind of what types of plants need. So thinking about water a little bit, how much stuff needs, sun versus shade. There's sometimes when we can kind of group specific different types of plants together where we can combine maybe some of our ornamental plants with some of our more vegetable, garden, edible plants. And this is a great way to create diversity, different interests, different heights, different leaf structures, different ways of kind of bringing more of a natural look to your garden. And so by combining plants that have the same types of requirements is a really great way to do that. So combining things like a rhododendron and a blueberry, they both like more acidic soil. They both can handle a little bit of shade, but also need the sun. And they also like a little bit more moist environments. Stuff like roses and lettuce. This is not something you would imagine putting in the same space. But roses have a little bit deeper of a root system. And when they are big and blooming is when lettuce needs to be shaded. And so lettuce works by planting underneath. The roses actually protect them from the hot afternoon sun. And the shallow root system of the lettuce doesn't compete with the roses. So it's a great way to kind of utilize both those spaces in your garden so that you're maximizing the amount of area that you're able to have in. Looking at perennial flowers with rhubarb. Rhubarb is an early spring blooming, growing plant. So by the time it is done in like end of June, July, you have perennial flowers coming up around it, being able to come up and fill in that space. Bulbs and root crops go well together because you don't want to disturb those different types of roots. They grow up and kind of work together within their space. Succulents and many of our herbs, specifically herbs that grow in more of a Mediterranean environment, like to have that more hot, dry, well-draining soil. So it's a great way to be able to work those into the same space. When we do this, it is also important to make sure that we are aware and that everyone that is harvesting from these areas know what is edible and not, and so that we don't have any sort of issues with anyone getting sick by harvesting something that shouldn't be eaten. So always keeping that in mind when we are putting plants together. So looking at locations. So we talked a little bit about slope and temperature, the amount of sun. So one thing that I think is really important and really a good idea for everyone to do if you haven't done it before is to go out and actually map your yard. And so by doing this, you're looking at the different areas where maybe you have the shady spots, where you have a big evergreen tree, where maybe your neighbor has a larger fence or there's an overhang, thinking about the types of soil that you have and maybe which way and a different wet spot that there is. So think about that, mapping out your garden, looking at different ways that maybe you want to separate your annual veggie bed, or maybe you want to interplant with ornamentals like we were just talking about. Thinking about how you're grouping those plants together, thinking about how the mature size of those plants are going to get. So something like a tomato is only going to be around for a little bit of the year and get 8 feet, but something like an apple tree is going to be around for a very, very long time and can get 20 feet tall and will then create these different areas within your yard. So making sure you are imagining how big they're going to get so you don't have to move stuff or run into having to over prune something to make it fit in its space. And then always aesthetics. Some people like to have their ornamental plants separate from their edible plants. I do really like to mix them together. I think stuff like blueberries have a beautiful fall color and a stem color. And then you have things like kale and rhubarb that have big, beautiful leaves that kind of work in. So looking at trying to combine those together, I think is a really fun way to look at that when you're kind of working them into your garden. And then soil quality, and we'll go into soil in more detail a little bit later on, but it's definitely one of the most important things, I think, when we're looking at our garden spaces. So next poll question, how much do you know about building healthy soil? 1, nothing. 2, a little, I'm just a beginning gardener. Or 3, a great deal, I know about soil types and what it takes for healthy soil. Soil is one of those things that can be quite a mystery. And like I said, is a very important part of all of our gardens. And I think it's important for us to keep an eye on. Okay. So healthy soil is, to me, kind of one of it's like the immune system for our plants. So I think it's really important to think about as the basis for making sure we have good healthy plants and good environment for those plants and crops to grow. You think about it like the immune system. If your immune system is down, you're not feeling so good, you're more likely to get sick. The same thing happens with plants. If they don't have good, healthy soil, they're more likely to be hurting, be more attracted to different diseases and different pests. So it's important to be able to make sure that we have that good, healthy soil. Healthy soil drains well, nourishes your plants, and also does not help to introduce toxins to your garden. So it's really important to be able to have that good draining soil and to be able to have it as a habitat. Soil is a living thing, so we need to make sure we're feeding it. And some of the different ways we can do that is by adding compost and also cover crops if things aren't growing. And this picture here is an example of some cover crops growing in the fall after we have been done harvesting. So when we look at soil, we are also trying to figure out the different types of soil that we have. So when we think about the different types, we have 3 different types we generally think about: clay, sand, and loam. So clay is really our fine kind of type of soil. So we often think of clay soil as being bad, but clay is holding moisture, it's holding nutrients in our soil. Our sand is really well draining, but doesn't hold a lot of nutrients. And then our loam is kind of like a mixture of everything all together. So it's important to be able to have a good combination to be able to have good, healthy soil. Our edible plants oftentimes need to have well draining soil. They need to have that airflow to be able to have air pockets. Root systems they need oxygen just like we do to breathe. Plants need to breathe not only from up above, but also down below. Some of the exceptions that can handle a little bit more moisture rich, wet soils are things like cranberries, lingonberries, and blueberries. These guys like to have a much more moist, heavier soil. So that's one of the ways, if you're thinking about in your garden, when you're mapping it out, where can you fit in some of these different types of plants? If you have a more boggy or wet area, those would be some good ones to be able to put into there. You can really help to improve your soil by just adding organic amendments. And I'll give you a little list here in a minute. And then also looking at soil testing to really understand more about what is going on within your soil. King Conservation District offers up to 5 free soil tests within their service area. And they partner with a group called A&L Laboratories down in Portland, Oregon to do these tests. And so if you're outside of their service area, they run around $20. So still totally worth it. And I highly recommend it to anybody to get a soil test done. More than just the little ones that you can get from a hardware store. Because the tests done from labs, they're giving you a pH, your macro and micronutrients, your organic matter percentage, and then also your cation exchange capacity. And it's really important to have all of them because it gives you a much better picture about what is going on in your gardens. Because everything actually works together. You can't really pick out just one thing to improve. You need to look at it as a whole. So with soil testing, some of the things that we really like to look at is not only the nutritional status, so like I was mentioning, but also thinking about as we plant stuff, those plants are pulling out different nutrients. And so it's changing the way those garden spaces are. So every couple of years, maybe like every 3 years or so, it's a good idea to do it, just to be able to follow how the plants are pulling those nutrients out. And then also, especially when you have a brand new garden that you're going in, so you know what you're starting out with. If you have any sort of toxins that you might be concerned about, and a lot of times we think about these for houses that are built before 1970, because there could be lead in the paints, which can then get into our soil. Different if you have built an industrial site, commercial orchards that maybe had high levels of pesticides or different types of chemicals used, different garages, or gas stations or anything like that, there might be some residues left over. The regular soil tests are not going to give you those toxin reports. You're going to have to do a separate test for that. But if you are concerned about it, it is a good thing to do so that you know what you're working with. And then lastly, the sarco plume area. And I'm going to go into more detail about that, since in South King County, we are in the sarco plume area. So if you are not familiar, there was the Tacoma smelter plume, a sarco site down just in Ruston, was a large area where they actually kind of, trying to remember exactly what the chemicals were that they were doing, but they were mining stuff, and a lot of the plume that came out was creating a lot of lead, arsenic, and cadmium that then fell down as it came down into the sky and then landed, unfortunately, in a lot of our areas around. So we have a picture coming up here of a map of what it is, but there's different ways that you can check on it and see if you're in the area, and a lot of different resources through the Department of Ecology and also King County. So the Dirt Alert program does a lot of work on how to protect yourself from that potentially contaminated soil. There's a soil safety program, different yard cleanups, and then also technical assistance depending on how high a levels that you might be. So if you can see here, so the Dirt Alert program is the one that covers the Sarco smelter from the different emissions that came down, and kind of it's South King County and then Pierce County and part of Thurston County is where that smelter was. There is other smelters that are kind of in other areas. And let's see if you go back here. So Vashon is where I grew up, and I was right at the bottom of that, and unfortunately had the high levels at my parents' house. So we did a lot of different things to protect ourselves growing up. So what the smelter did was it settled the pollution. So all of the emissions from the pollution fell down and settled on surfaces for more than 1,000 square miles. And so the main two contaminants that have been found in the soils are arsenic and lead, because they do not go away very quickly. The good thing is that arsenic and lead they're not commonly uptaken into plants. It's more just in the soil itself. So it's important that we know about this and that we work through this, because lead is associated with different developmental disabilities. Arsenic can cause cancer later on and contribute to heart disease. And then especially children under the age of 6 are at a higher risk, mainly because of just the activity of them playing outside, and it's the dirt that gets on their hands and then can get in their mouths. So unfortunately, us being gardeners and being healthy outside doing that, we are also putting ourselves more at risk. So it's just important to be very careful about washing your hands and making sure we're getting that dirt off. If you are concerned about it, you can go to the Department of Ecology website, and you can also Google search Dirt Alert, and it will pop up a map where you can type in your address, and it will tell you your potential contamination levels, and then you'll have to get it checked to know exactly. But it is a way to double check it just in case. So the different ways people are exposed, it's through actually, like I said, swallowing and that contaminated soil, also inhaling that dust. So it's not necessarily absorbed through the skin. It's more just gets stuck on you. So making sure that you're being good about cleaning yourself. So washing your hands, taking off shoes at the door so you're not tracking it through, mopping and vacuuming, washing toys for children that may have been coming in contact with soil outside, wearing gloves when you are gardening, washing your pets, washing all your fruits and vegetables, and then wiping any of your pet paws off. So like I said, just trying to keep the soil from getting into your house and being closer to you. The other thing that can help is to add mulches to be able to cover bare patches of soil so that you don't have that dust floating up. So making sure the soil is moist before you're working in it, wearing a dust mask if necessary, building raised beds if you do have issues with contaminated soil, thinking about peeling any produce that maybe comes into contact with the soil to make sure that is completely free of that soil. And then once again, wearing the gloves and then testing that soil just to make sure to see whether it is contaminated soil or not. So some of the different soil amendments that can also help, because what you're doing is you're not only building that healthy soil, you're also kind of diluting some of that extra contaminated soil. So by adding these soil amendments, you're helping to dilute those different contaminants, and you're helping to add that good healthy soil to, or contribute to building that good healthy soil so that your plants can actually grow up nice. So looking at compost, cover crops like I mentioned before, different leaf or straw mulches that will help to break down and protect your soil, coffee grounds, eggshells. All of these different soil amendments are helping to increase organisms. They're contributing to more like mycorrhizae and different bioflora that is growing and living in that soil, which is helping to add nutrients and then also helping to increase the amount of plants that you have growing. So when we look at watering, watering is one of those big ones in our garden spaces. So one of the big things with watering is people don't often think about the fact that we have a drought in the summertime. We think about how much rain we get for the rest of the year. We forget about the summertime. So it's important to plan out where your water sources are going to be, because edible gardens specifically needs a lot of water. We put these plants in, they're growing as big as they possibly can get for our annuals and some of our smaller perennials. They're growing a lot within a single year, so they need a lot of water. And you don't want to be hauling stuff all over the place. So how far is your water source from your garden? Maybe it's all the way around the backside of your yard, so it's going to be really hard for you to be able to get there and water your garden all the time. So thinking about that, maybe you need to put in some sort of irrigation, or maybe you can have rainwater come down and be able to be a part of your garden space. So putting in a rain barrel to be able to help collect some of that water. Thinking about what types of plants you have around. So maybe you have some evergreen plants that are blocking some of the rainwater. So you're creating a dry spot underneath, which is making it harder for those root systems to be able to absorb all of that water. So it's important to think about that as the plants grow up. So if we have our tomato plants, they get nice and big, they might be blocking water from something on the other side of it, depending on where our irrigation is. It's also important to think about those ones that like to have drier environments. So things like our Mediterranean plants that I mentioned before. So a lot of our herbs, sage, oregano, rosemary, thyme, all of these like to have those drier environments. So putting them on the edges, putting them in areas where maybe they won't get as much water, putting them more in a higher spot or where there's more drainage will help with that. It's important to think about when we water, and a lot of this has to do with how plants do with absorbing water and how they kind of protect themselves as they're growing. We like to think about watering in the morning as much as possible. Part of this is because it allows the leaves to dry off before going into the day. We try not to water the leaves as much, but if any water does get on them, it allows them to dry off. It also allows the soil and the moisture to go down into the soil deeper before the sun comes out and actually evaporates all of that water. A lot of our plants need quite a bit of water that we're trying to grow. So you want as much of that water to stay in the soil as possible and as little to actually evaporate. If we water in the evenings, then we want to make sure it's straight at the base of the plant. Some of our cool weather crops, like lettuces, some of the brassicas, can handle more of the evening watering. It's still best if you can to do it in the morning because it allows that water to fully soak in so that they also have that water source throughout the rest of the day. Another great thing with some of the different mulches that you can do, which not only helps to hold in moisture because it's creating a layer that is a barrier from the sun evaporating that water, and it also helps to hold down weeds. So you limit the amount of competition with a lot of your different plants, not only with the air space and the light space, but also with the root space down below. And it also helps to reduce any sort of compaction from those plants. So mulch is a great way to kind of add another layer in there. Some of the examples, like the straw that you have here, any different types of leaves, like dried leaves that you might have. So especially this time of the year, as we're starting to go into fall, think about trying to gather up some of those dried leaves and maybe putting them in a space where they can kind of sit until next spring and you can kind of protect some of your plants. Or if you have any plants that you're overwintering, taking some of those dried leaves and putting them around to kind of create a little barrier. Burlap is a great one if you have more open, kind of bigger beds where maybe you don't have a whole bunch of stuff planted. And then compost is always great to add as a layer. It not only is acting as a mulch layer to protect that soil, it also then is breaking itself down even more and working in to build that healthy habitat. So thinking about integrated pest management. So we talked about how to kind of make sure we have healthy plants, different environments that we need to have plants, and why that's important. So part of this environment that we're creating is we're looking at a sustainable approach to managing pests by looking at not only biological, cultural, and physical ways, and then as a last resort, some of those chemical ways to help with economic and healthy environmental risks. So we like to think about this as in a holistic way. So think about how nature does it, how nature works. So we want to manage our pests in a way by thinking about that proper placement. So we don't want to put a shady plant in a bright sunny spot because it is going to be stressed out and then it's going to be more likely to have different pests coming to it. That good soil. So we don't want to put a plant like a blueberry in a very alkaline type of a soil environment because it's not going to be absorbing the nutrients that it needs to properly grow. Observation is one of the biggest things you can do, making sure we're preparing and getting our different garden spaces ready, and then really focusing on being in the garden space and looking at your plants every day or every other day and seeing what is going on. How are things changing to what is happening? Proper watering. If we overwater a plant, we are stressing the plants out just as much as we are underwatering plants. By overwatering, you're creating potential root rot situations, which can then harbor different diseases. By underwatering, we are stressing plants out and they're unable to get all of the nutrients that they need to be able to survive. By having a plant diversity is very important to be able to increase. We don't want to have monocrops. We want to have diversity. Think about nature. Think about bringing in and creating habitat for many different types of insects, mammals, and other birds that all come through to be able to be a part of it all. Everything is working together in our gardens so that we can reduce the amount of chemicals and different types of output or fertilizer inputs that we are putting into our garden spaces. We want to create a good, healthy habitat. Crop rotation is super important when we're thinking about our different edible crops, because it can help reduce a lot of different diseases and pest issues for our more of around our annual edibles. So like our tomatoes versus our broccolis, making sure we're rotating these crops. And this all contributes to plant health, and also looking at healthy plants as a thing can help to fend off different diseases and pests and make them more resilient. And then those different potential issues aren't going to be as drastic or problematic as if they were unhealthy plants. So I mentioned observation. So one thing I think is important to think about is, like I said, go and be present in your garden, walk around, take notes, see what might be changing. How are plants growing? What types of insects do you see on your different types of plants? Do you see any beneficial insects? Do you see any other types of birds? Or do you see any sort of pests that are showing up? Do you see different diseases that might be popping up? Making a note of these, keeping a little notebook is really helpful to be able to keep track of how things are changing so that you can take care of them before they become too big of a problem. And make sure you're doing it often, because things can change quite quickly if you aren't prepared for it. They're oftentimes trying to come up with new disease resistance types of plants. So it's important to try and find, if you can, if you know that you're in an area where you're susceptible to different diseases, try and find plants that are resistant to these. We try and look at a lot of different native plants for different areas because they are used to our environment. They know and are used to our wet winters and our dry summers. So they're more likely to be more resilient in the different environments that we have. We have a lot of different issues with mildews and funguses because of our early spring wet and then our wet fall. And so those transition periods are breeding grounds for fungus and mildews and all of that. So it's one of those ways for us to be able to counteract that, is to find any sort of plants that maybe have a little bit of resistance to that. So looking at specific varieties within plant families that maybe are a little bit more resistant. And then with the diversity in your garden, as I mentioned, you want to create an environment that is encouraging insects and birds and different beneficial animals so that we can help with reducing that insect control. There's a little bit of tolerance that needs to happen sometimes, because we don't want a sterile environment where we have no pests, because then we would have no beneficial animals to help eat and keep those under control. So it's a balance. It's a natural balance that we're trying to create so that we have enough food for things without destroying the plants that we are trying to grow. And then treatment. This is really looking at the least toxic, only the safest non-toxic products as much as possible, and focusing on our healthy environments that we're creating, our observation, and maybe our mechanical of pulling and picking things off, than actually trying to create and add something without spraying and trying to do any sort of those types of treatments if possible.